The day my wife's sister sat in my living room, folded her hands in her lap, and told me I needed to be reasonable about all this. I had already been reasonable for 3 weeks and 4 days. She didn't know what my version of reasonable looked like, but she was going to. My name is Len Corbett. I am 63 years old. I've held an electrical contractor's license in Kingston, Ontario for 31 years. I built that business from a second-hand van and a reputation for showing up on time and doing the work right. I raised one daughter, stayed in one marriage for 22 years, and I trusted 2 people in this world with the kind of trust that doesn't come with conditions or fine print. That trust turned out to be the most costly thing I ever extended, in ways that had nothing to do with money, though it had quite a lot to do with money as well, as it turned out. Let me take you back to the Thursday evening in early April when I drove home from Sudbury 6 days ahead of schedule. I'd been up there on a subcontract job, a new commercial build just outside the city, good, solid work, 6 weeks in total, coming home on weekends when I could and sometimes when I couldn't. The job wrapped early and I didn't bother calling ahead. I figured my wife would just be glad to see me. I drove 7 hours south on the 400 and pulled into the driveway at just past 8 in the evening. The front light was off. My wife's car was in the driveway. Shane's truck was parked on the street. I want to tell you what Shane represented before I tell you what I walked in on. He lived 4 houses down. We had fished together every August up in Muskoka for going on 16 years. The same stretch of lake, the same cabin, the same Thursday night where we'd sit on the dock after dark and talk about absolutely nothing important. He'd helped me reshingle my garage roof in 2019 and refused to take a cent for it. He sat at my kitchen table so often over the years that I had long since stopped noticing when his boots were on the mat by the door. He came to my mother's funeral. I introduced him to every person I knew as my closest friend. I walked through my front door with my duffel on my shoulder and my mind still half in Sudbury. They were in the kitchen. I will not describe what I found in detail, not because I can't, but because some things a man carries quietly, and that is one of them. What I will tell you is the expression on my wife's face in the first half second before shock arrived. That expression told me something no message, no confrontation, no midnight conversation ever could have. It told me this was not new. This was not a mistake in the process of happening. This was an arrangement. I had simply walked back into it uninvited. Shane left. He said my name on his way out once like a question. I didn't answer it. I sat at my kitchen table. My wife stood near the counter, saying things I wasn't yet processing. I looked at the surface of that table, the same one where I'd had 10,000 cups of coffee, where my daughter did homework in the 90s, where I signed the papers on our rental property out in Frontenac County back in 2009. That table. I sat there and I did the math on 16 years of friendship, and I kept coming up short. Len, talk to me. Go upstairs, I said. I need to sit here for a bit. She went. I don't know how long I sat, long enough for the kitchen to go dark. Welcome to Dad's fierce revenge. Get settled, because this one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And hit that subscribe button if you're new here. You're going to want to stick around. I want to be straight with you about what the days after that looked like, because I think people expect a man my age, 63, with 31 years of building things and standing behind his work, to either blow up or fall apart. They expect the shouting or the silence that smells like defeat. That is not what happened. What happened was cold and clear and very quiet. I gave myself 1 hour each morning. I'd drive to the Tim Hortons on Division Street, park in the lot, engine off, coffee going cold in the cup holder. 1 hour to feel everything I couldn't afford to feel inside the house. The betrayal, the specific humiliation of 16 years of friendship being used the way it had been, the particular pain of remembering that Shane had raised his glass at the Legion Remembrance Day dinner last November and said, "To the people who matter." My wife 2 tables over, both of them looking right at me. 1 hour, then I drove home and went back to work. 25 days of those mornings. 25 days of sitting across the breakfast table from a woman who had learned to look me in the eye through 31 years of understanding exactly how much I trusted her. I was genuinely astonished, not at the affair itself, but at the precision, the steadiness of it. On day 4, I called a family lawyer whose name had been passed to me by a colleague who'd been through a complicated split of his own and had come out the other side intact. Her name was Margaret T.C., and her office was on Princess Street. I sat across from her on a rainy Tuesday morning and I laid out the facts without commentary. She didn't flinch. She didn't offer me tissues from the corner of the desk. She had a legal pad and a pen, and she used them both at a steady pace. "Have you said anything to her directly?" "No." She looked up. "How long since the discovery?" 4 days. She wrote something. Have you spoken to anyone about it? No. She set the pen flat. Don't. And start gathering every financial document you have access to. Joint accounts, registered savings, investment statements, property records. Bring me everything. I liked her right away. She walked me through it plainly. Ontario operates on equitable distribution, she explained. Marital assets divided according to what's fair, and fair doesn't always mean equal, especially when one spouse has made financial moves without the other's knowledge or consent. She told me to be methodical. She told me to be thorough. She told me to say nothing at home that I wouldn't want read back to me in a hearing. And if property is involved, she said, leaning forward slightly, I need every document, every deed, every agreement, everything you've ever signed. That sentence turned out to be the most important one spoken that entire morning. Over 22 years, my wife and I had built two things that represented real financial weight. The first was a rental property out in Frontenac County, a 3-bedroom house on 2 acres we'd bought in 2009, rented steadily ever since, reliable income that had more than carried its own mortgage. The second was our combined TFSA and RRSP contributions, which had grown over 2 decades of disciplined saving into just over $340,000. On day 7, I pulled the account statements and I found it. $18,000 transferred out of our joint TFSA on March 9th into an account I had no access to. March 9th was a Tuesday 3 weeks before I came home from Sudbury. I printed the statement and placed it on my desk alongside the others in a folder I'd labeled Financial Summary 2024. Because that's what it was. A summary of what she had decided and when she had decided it and how much she'd assumed I wasn't looking. I took that folder to Margaret on day 11. She read it carefully and then looked at me over the desk. This is unilateral dissipation of marital assets. Ontario courts take a dim view of transfers like this. Funds moved during a period of marital breakdown without consent into a personal account. This factors into equitable distribution in ways that are not going to favor her position. There's also the property, I said. I slid the Frontenac County documents across the desk. When we'd bought that property in 2009, our solicitor at the time had included a clause in the purchase agreement, one of those provisions that seems overly careful until 15 years later when it's the only thing standing between you and losing something you built with your own hands. The clause noted that funds derived from a spouse's premarital inheritance, if traceable and documented, would be considered in equitable distribution calculations. I had purchased that property part with the proceeds from my mother's house in Napanee after she passed in 2008. My money. Documented. Separate. Margaret took her glasses off and set them on the desk. You've been very organized, she said. 31 years as a contractor, I said. If you don't document it, it doesn't exist. My wife came to me on a Sunday evening in early May. She had been waiting, I think, for something to break, for me to yell or plead or issue some ultimatum she could negotiate around. I had done none of those things. I had been present, quiet, and entirely unreadable. I think that frightened her more than anything I could have said aloud. She sat across from me in the living room, and she was already crying before she settled into the chair, which told me exactly how she'd planned this conversation to go and exactly what she expected my reaction to be. I need to tell you about Shane, she said. Okay, I said. She told me it had started 14 months ago. She called it something that spiraled out of hand. 14 months is not something that spirals. 14 months is a deliberate decision renewed continuously every morning and every evening by two people who knew precisely what they were doing and chose to continue. It is Christmas. It is my birthday in February, when she made a chocolate cake and a card that said, "To the man who holds everything together." It is 16 years of friendship turned methodically against me. But I let her talk. She told me Shane had ended things. 3 weeks before I came home from Sudbury, he'd decided the situation had become too complicated. She said this with a very specific pain, the pain of someone who had believed genuinely that it meant more to him than it did. That told me something important about the nature of what she'd been part of. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, she said, but I don't want to lose everything we've built. I just need you to hear that. How long ago did you make the transfer? I asked. She went still. What transfer? The TFSA, March 9th. The pause that followed told me everything. She had hoped, very specifically, that question would not come. I was frightened, she said. I didn't know what was going to happen. I nodded slowly. I need some time to think, I said. She looked at me with something between relief and confusion, the beginning of an assumption that calm meant the start of forgiveness. She was wrong. 4 days later, her family arrived. Her older sister Joyce came first, and she brought Irene, their mother, who is 81 years old and who, to her considerable credit, looked genuinely ill at ease throughout most of what followed. And then there was Brad, my wife's son from her first marriage, 31 years old, who had lived in Barrie for the past decade, and who had never found much use for me in all the years I'd been in his mother's life. They arranged themselves in my living room with the settled confidence of people who had discussed this on the drive over. Joyce opened. She is a practical woman, and she approaches most things the way she approached this, with the conviction of someone who has decided on the conclusion before the conversation begins. Len, nobody here is minimizing how painful this is, but the decisions you make in the next few weeks are going to affect the rest of both your lives. We're just asking you to think carefully, to be reasonable. I appreciate that, I said. She blinked. She had prepared for a different kind of opening. We're not asking you to forget anything, she continued, recalibrating. But the property, the savings, you built those together. That has to count for something. It counts for quite a bit, I said. I've been thinking about it very carefully. Irene said almost nothing throughout. She sat with her hands around her tea and looked out the window for the better part of an hour. At some point, she found the small dish of peppermints I keep on the side table and worked her way through them quietly, with the peaceful focus of a woman who has decided that this is not her fight to pick up. I had known Irene for 22 years, and I had always respected her. I wish she hadn't had to be there for this part. Brad was another matter. He had his arms crossed before he sat down. He had the posture of a man who has made up his mind before he walked through the door and is now waiting for the room to catch up. He looked at me with the particular confidence of someone who has never personally been let down by his mother and has no plans to start. Look, he said, I'm going to be straight with you. You walking away from this marriage and taking half of everything Mom worked for isn't fixing anything. It's just going to blow up both your lives over something that can be worked through. She made a mistake. That doesn't mean you burned 22 years to the ground. He said it the way people say things when they believe they've closed the matter, like he'd done me a service just by showing up and saying it plainly. I looked at Brad, then at Joyce, then at Irene, who had finished the peppermints and was now sitting with her empty teacup, looking at the window with an expression that told me she had removed herself from the proceedings at a spiritual level, which I found I could not blame her for in the slightest. Brad, I said quietly, you're right that 22 years means something. I don't think you'll find me arguing with that. He nodded. His shoulders dropped a fraction. The room settled. Joyce exhaled. And I want to tell you, right there in that living room, with 3 members of my wife's family sitting across from me looking cautiously relieved, I want to tell you what none of them knew. They did not know that Margaret TSE had already filed the divorce application on my behalf, 3 days prior, certified and submitted. They did not know that the TFSA transfer had been formally documented and included in the court submission. They did not know that the Frontenac County property, the one I had partly purchased with my mother's Napanee inheritance, had a clause attached to it that Margaret had described as unusually clear in its provisions for a document of that vintage. They did not know that I had spent 12 meetings over 25 days going through 31 years of financial records with the unhurried precision of a man who built his career on knowing what he signed. They thought they were talking to a man standing at a decision. They were talking to a man who had already decided, had the documentation in order, and was simply waiting for the right moment to step back and let the paperwork make its own argument. If you've been listening for a while, do us one favor. Hit the subscribe button and drop a like while you're at it. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'll see you down there. Let me take you back to those 25 mornings in the Tim Hortons parking lot, because that is where the real work happened. Margaret was direct and unhurried, and she had the quality of someone who has heard every variation of betrayal and has stopped being surprised by any of them. She got things done without narrating them. I went to her office 12 times over those 4 weeks. Each time I arrived with a folder, organized by date. Each time I left with a clearer sense of exactly where things stood and exactly what needed to happen next. She told me once, near the end of our work together, "You are the most organized client I've had in 11 years of family law, and I have had some very organized clients." 31 years as a contractor, I said. If it's not in writing, it didn't happen. She almost smiled. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. I retained the Frontenac County property. The documentation of the original purchase funds was complete and traceable, and The court's equitable distribution assessment reflected the reality of what I had brought into that asset. The TFSA transfer was treated as dissipation of marital assets, which shaped the final accounting in ways that were not generous to my wife's position. The settlement was fair in the specific sense that it was accurate, not punishing, not generous, just accurate, and accuracy, in my experience, is the most honest form of fairness there is. My wife retained the joint checking account, her personal RRSP, the contents of the house, and a smaller share of the registered investments than her lawyer had initially sought. She did not contest the final terms. Shane had, by that point, moved to a condo out near Canada. I know this not because I was tracking him, but because a fellow from the Legion mentioned it once in the parking lot after a Wednesday meeting, with the careful tone of a man unsure whether he should be saying it at all. Shane had apparently found the future he and my wife had imagined somewhat less appealing once it required actual commitment. That is a pattern I've come to understand that tends to reveal itself precisely when it can no longer remain hidden. I did not call him. I had nothing to say to him that mattered more than my silence. About a month before the settlement was finalized, I reached out to Joyce. I asked if she'd meet me for coffee. She said yes. We met at a cafe on the waterfront on a Wednesday morning in October. I arrived first. I ordered 2 coffees. I had a folder on the table when she sat down. I slid it across without a word and let her read. She was quiet for several minutes. When she looked up, her face had shifted in the way faces shift when information rearranges itself around facts that were previously missing. "This is the account transfer," she said. "March 9th, while I was in Sudbury." She turned a page. "And this is the property clause. From 2009, our solicitor at the time included it. It seemed overly careful back then." Joyce closed the folder, set her hands flat on the table. "I sat in your living room," she said slowly, "and told you to be reasonable about the property and the savings. You did, without knowing any of this. You were working with what you had," I said. "I understand that. I'm not telling you this to be unkind. But you sat in my home and formed a strong opinion without the full picture. I thought you deserved to have it." She was quiet for a long moment, then, "I owe you an apology, Len." "You don't have to." "No, firm?" "I do." We sat for a while longer. I asked about Irene. Joyce said she was doing well enough for 81, which is all you can ask. I said I was genuinely glad to hear it. "Brad never reached out." "That's his right. He is his mother's son, and his loyalty belongs where it belongs. I have no argument with a son who protects his mother. I just wish he'd walked into my living room with a bit more information and a bit less certainty. He'll find his way to one or the other eventually. Or he won't." The fishing cabin in Muskoka had always been in my name alone. I bought it with my brother-in-law back in 1997, bought him out in 2004, and the deed had been mine ever since. My wife had used it, of course. We both had every August for years. I never thought of it as mine versus ours. It simply was what it was. Now it's what it was again. Last September, the Friday after the settlement was finalized, I drove up in the morning. 5 hours north, the 400 to Huntsville, and then the side roads I can do without thinking. I arrived early afternoon, opened the cabin up, got the dock cleared off. I made a shore lunch on the propane burner. Pickerel I'd caught that morning, potatoes, a tin of baked beans. The same meal I've been making on that dock since 1997. I sat there in the September sun and ate it without thinking about anything in particular, which is its own kind of accomplishment. My daughter drove up Saturday and stayed until Monday. She's 34 and she lives in Ottawa, and she is of everything I am proud of in my life, the thing that needs no qualification. We fished Sunday morning and caught nothing useful and had a fine time regardless. I don't hate my wife. What she did was painful in the specific way that only a long and trusting marriage can produce. Because the material for the wound has to come from somewhere, and it only exists because something real was there first. I carry that carefully now. But I don't carry it everywhere. I put it down somewhere between the first morning in the Tim Hortons parking lot and the afternoon on the dock when the light was doing what September light does up in Muskoka, and everything around me was very quiet and very much mine. Here is what I want to leave you with. People have said to me, and I understand the instinct, that they don't know why I didn't confront her the moment I came home, why I didn't make it loud, why I didn't make it immediate. Here is what 63 years has taught me. Noise is easy. Noise costs you nothing. What costs you is the discipline to go quiet long enough to understand the full situation, long enough to protect what you've earned, long enough to let the truth make its own case in front of the people who thought they already knew the whole story. My wife's family told me to be reasonable and consider everyone involved. They weren't entirely wrong. I was reasonable. I considered everyone involved. I just did it with a lawyer, a folder, and 31 years of knowing how to read a contract before I signed it. You get quiet, you get organized, and then you let the paperwork say what you've been too steady to say out loud. I went back to my shore lunch. It was by any measure exactly what it needed to be.